So the teaching is a conceptual framework. It's a set of concepts that are delivered, um, new information, you can say. Concepts are descriptions or theories. They are the deliverance of an idea. And in particular, it's important to relate to these concepts often as descriptions, and descriptions of what might happen, but descriptions of dynamics in life is a good way of relating to the concepts. So what do I mean by a concept? So a concept being a description or an idea, um, a theory. The whole teaching as a whole can be called a conceptual framework. And within that conceptual framework, there are many sub-concepts. And you can break a concept down to something very simple, or a concept can be something very simple, like human beings are all always seeking happiness. Now, the concept doesn't have to be correct. A concept in itself is just a theory or a statement, a description. So this is a concept. Human beings are looking for happiness. Concept. Happiness for the human being is available. That's a concept. There is its opposite concept. Happiness for the human being is not available. They're both concepts. So human beings have lots of concepts. Some are accurate and some are inaccurate. Some are accurate from a certain angle and not accurate from another angle. And often what we tend to do with concepts is relate to the concept as if they are absolutely true. And no concept is the truth. That in itself is a concept. No concept is the truth. Someone could say some concepts are the truth. That would be another concept. We tend to relate to the concepts we have as if they are truth, which really means our relationship to what we hold is, we sort of say, I hold this because it's true. And if we can start to relate to our information about life differently to that, start to appreciate that concepts are relative descriptions or ideas, theories, which are not going to be absolutely true all of the time from all perspectives. So investigate that for yourself. You'll see that water is a wonderful thing, but if someone was allergic to water, it wouldn't be a wonderful thing. That's not a great example because there aren't any people may be allergic to water. So you can see that what is true from one angle, from another angle, might not be true. A concept will describe something like the apple is round. And someone might say, well, it's not actually round. Round is very specific. So you can see, well, it's portraying, but it's true, it's not really round. So also, let's say we call an apple round. So we say the apple is round, that's a concept, but the apple is also red. You could say the apple is round and the apple is red. But the apple is also sweet. So the concept is never going to describe the thing fully, no matter how you go, the apple is round and red and sweet. Someone say, well, the apple is small, so the apple is round and red and sweet and small. Someone else says, well, that's not really a small apple. I'll show you a small apple. And they bring in a smaller apple. And they say, well, look at this apple. This is a big apple. So you can see that concepts are also relative. We can have a concept today, the Liberal Party is the way to go. And at some point in the future, maybe tomorrow, the Liberal Party says something and you think the Liberal Party isn't the way to go. So you can change your concept from one moment to the other. It can be valid from a certain angle, and then at another time, which really means a different angle, it's not valid anymore. So these are ideas and they're always going to be changing. Our understanding about something is always limited. We can't understand something perfectly. So we will hold concepts about things based on our understanding. And then if we come to understand the subject with some more information, so we understand it better or differently, then our concept might change. The belief that I am not good enough or I am fantastic is based on a concept. Now, you might notice I said the belief is based on a concept. So in what way am I using the word belief? In this context, in the teaching, usually when I talk about belief, I'm talking about a concept that we have mistaken to be absolutely true, and we hold it as if it isn't a relative concept that may not be true, that can change, that might be based on a misinterpretation or a limited interpretation. So belief is where we say, this is how it is. We should always, if we can find that our thinking starts to relate to whatever we think with maybe, I think this is how it is, or which means we always understand that our view is not absolute. So if you find yourself getting into an argument with someone, it's if we realize I might have this wrong, I might have misinterpreted what the topic's about. I might be missing the point that someone was making and arguing something without it being directly related to the point of the conversation. So it's very good for us not to be too definitive, not to be too emphatic, not to be too aggressive with what we think about a topic. The more emphatic we are, the more likely we will get embarrassed from time to time. Because our thinking usually does channel us down a certain route where we're pretty sure we understand everything and that we're making a good point. And that's how our thinking tends to work, is we think we've understood something. It feels like, oh, I definitely haven't misunderstood this. And then afterwards we realize, oh, I had misunderstood what the discussion was about, let's say, or what the point was about. And then it can be embarrassing. And it's not so much about avoiding embarrassment. It's more about coming to realize a certain principle that can be introduced in thinking, a way of thinking about thinking. And if we do start to pay attention to our thinking, which means we start to become more equipped, our intellect becomes more equipped about the functionality of thought, that is very related to this topic of peace of mind for the human being, happiness for the human being. So I started off saying that humans are looking for happiness. That's a concept, it's a description. Someone might argue against that. And I could say that, sure, people are not only looking for happiness, they might, in a different context, in a different scenario, be looking for something like vegetables growing healthily. If they are a market gardener and their objective is vegetables, and they're what they are looking for relative to that specific task is for their vegetables to be juicier, bigger, stronger, more full of vitamins. So this is also a demonstration of how a concept is relative. So the concept is human beings are looking for happiness relative to what are we looking for in general in life. I think that concept, well, it's my concept, and I think it's accurate relative to that. But for someone applying themselves to a very specific task at a specific point in time, they're not looking for happiness. They're looking for a solution to a specific problem, let's say, that has to do with growing vegetables. So these talks are about human happiness. And human happiness is available. Human happiness is to be found in a very specific form. The form in which human happiness is available is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And humanity seems to be looking for happiness, which is the right looking for. So happiness is what we're looking for. Humanity, however, is looking for happiness in outcomes, looking for happiness in pleasure. And happiness isn't to be found, as I just mentioned, happiness is to be found in the form of continuous, unbroken peace of mind. When you ask someone, what are you looking for in life? They might not say, I'm looking for happiness. It might not have been registered. So that's why this concept is an important one, because as part of our seeking to become clearer and clearer on what we're looking for is very important. So even though I say everyone in life is looking for happiness, that's the concept here, the reality, the actuality is they might not know that they're looking for happiness. Because what has happened is their intellect, their biological movement is moving them now towards happiness in a specific form. Happiness that the body-mind organism has concluded happiness will be found in this form. And that has been concluded on a subconscious level. So now, as on a conscious level, the person is just looking for whatever the body-mind organism has decided they need. So it could be financial independence, or a new car, a new house, a new job, a new lover or partner. So if you asked someone, they might say, oh, I'm looking for my purpose in life. I'm looking for my twin flame. So consciously, that's what they think they're looking for. Whereas if we ask, why are you looking for that? It might seem like an odd question to them. What do you mean, why? Because it's so obvious but it's not registered consciously because they haven't answered the question, oh, I'm just looking to be happy. They've answered the question, I'm looking for a new job, or I'm looking for my purpose in life. I'm deep down, I'm looking for a partner. Why are you looking for a partner? As I said, it can seem like an odd question. It's odd because the assumption must be, well, that would be a good thing, won't it? Why will it be a good thing? Why are you looking for that? And the reality is because it has been concluded that when I get that, then I'll be happy. So what if the person is wrong about what will make them happy, and yet the body-mind organism has locked away that concept as truth? And so now all attention is on that holy grail because the body-mind organism has locked away the concept on an unconscious level. My happiness will be found when I find my partner or my purpose in life. That's been locked away. Now all of the attention is going towards finding that. And what if it's wrong? Isn't it better to say, I'm looking for happiness? That way, it's sort of like a maths problem. Is if you've made an error in a maths problem, everything after that is going to be wrong. And so when we're looking for something, we should keep in mind what it is we're really looking for, because if we've made some mistakes somewhere along the way and we've forgotten what it is we're really looking for, the mistake might not become apparent. So the suggestion is that we're all looking for happiness. We might not realize it. So whether we realize it or not, all human beings are looking for happiness. So I suggest, it's just a suggestion, that anyone listening can ask themselves this question: am I looking for happiness? Now, the intellect might kick in and go, well, no, actually, happiness is very superficial. I'm looking for my true nature, or I'm looking for, I just want to help the world. I just want to make the world a better place. That's what might come up as part of our deeply ingrained belief, because we might say, oh, happiness is very superficial. I don't want to admit that I'm looking for happiness, and maybe not even admit it. It's not maybe so much about admitting it. It might be it is unknown that there is a looking for happiness because it seems like that's superficial. And we've heard in teachings maybe that seeking is not about happiness, because another teaching might use the word happiness differently. Another teaching might categorize the word happiness as a form of pleasure, because in general terms, humanity is looking for happiness, whether they really realize it or not, in the form of pleasure. And so the word happiness has become so associated with pleasure, with getting circumstance. And so some teachings will address the problem because they're not taking an approach of being specific with certain words, because specific, don't get me wrong, specific is not always good. Specific can complicate something that, if it's delivered in a different way, can be more effective. Anyway, this teaching wants to be specific. So let's acknowledge that some teachings will say seeking is not about happiness. And this teaching is saying what everyone is looking for, whether you realize it or not, whether they realize it or not, is happiness. However, happiness is to be found in a very specific form. Happiness through continuous unbroken peace of mind. And peace of mind is something very particular. It's the absence of suffering. the absence of an uncomfortableness with oneself. That's what suffering really refers to in practical terms, an uncomfortableness with oneself. And peace of mind is not the gaining of something, but the falling away of suffering. And because when this movement of seeking happiness through pleasure has become so much ingrained, and that in the English language, happiness is used, oh, I'll be very happy to see you. I'm going to be very happy when I'm on holiday. It's about getting something. So happiness, the word happiness is associated with feeling, and unhappiness is associated with not pleasure, when you're not feeling joyous or feeling excited. And so because that's what's deeply ingrained, some teachings will say spiritual seeking, or what is available, enlightenment, has nothing to do with happiness. If we can see the nuance and see, that teaching says it has nothing to do with happiness. Roger says what we're seeking is happiness, and spirituality, enlightenment, is all about happiness, but happiness in the form of peace of mind. Then we can say, wow, look at that. That teaching has the concept that says enlightenment has nothing to do with happiness. Roger says enlightenment has everything to do with happiness, and they're saying exactly the same thing. They're not arguing with each other. They're just using the word happiness to using the word happiness in different ways. So one teaching is saying happiness is pleasure. And therefore it's saying liberation has nothing to do with pleasure, meaning liberation has nothing to do with happiness. Roger is saying humanity is seeking happiness in pleasure, but it's not to be found there. So he's saying enlightenment has nothing to do with pleasure. Enlightenment has everything to do with the end of suffering, peace of mind. And that, when it is delivered, is what we end up realizing is the happiness available for the human being. So this the teaching that says liberation is nothing about nothing to do with happiness. When you listen to it and you say, so what's it about? It'll say it's about the end of suffering. And that's what Roger's saying. So we sound like they're arguing with each other, or they're disagreeing with each other, but they're not. So we need to really become mindful of thinking so that the nuances can be seen. And all of the suffering is based on bad, deeply ingrained thinking that has been locked away from maybe even thousands of years ago, but more practically and pragmatically locked away from when we were young and when we interpreted the world through a developing intellect. And some of the errors about thinking that got put in place when we are young, not only the content, but even errors about how to think, perpetuate in adulthood. I'm seeing it a huge amount at the moment in social media in particular, where it's so I'm not talking about the content. So let's make it easy. You have someone who is anti-vaccine, someone who's pro-vaccine, someone who is pro-Democrat, and someone who's pro-Republican. So just taking opposite ends. Of someone who thinks the virus is all made up and doesn't exist, someone who thinks that it's very real. So I'm not interested in picking a side. What I'm interested in is whoever is coming up with their concept, the side on which they say this is where I stand. I'm not arguing about which side you should stand on, but what I'm interested in is how people think about what they believe in. So it's not about the top. I'm not interested in saying, oh, you're right, Republicans are great and Democrats are not, or you're right, Democrats are great and Republicans are not. That's not the point. I think anyone can have their side. But if someone has a side and their conclusion is based on bad thinking, whichever side it is, it's a shame. And it seems like everyone is picking sides based on bad thinking. When I say everyone, it just seems to be part of the human condition to not understand the limitations of thinking. And so much of the basis on which suffering arises is this bad thinking. Anyhow, we don't need to go into that too much. It sort of unfolds anyway within the talk. So, there's some teachings that will say, however we function is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning. That we are essentially destined to function a certain way because of our genetics. We're destined to get a certain illness because of our genetics. And then you'll have another teaching that says, I don't want to hear anyone tell me that your future is destined because of your genes. Your future is not destined because of your genes. And once again, it sounds like they're arguing with each other, and they're not. They're looking at different problems that if we're not careful, we don't realize that they're making different points. And we say, well, obviously, one teaching says, whatever happens in life is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and it's destined for that to happen. Another one says, I don't want to hear anyone say that their destiny is fixed because of their genes. So Bruce Lipton, I think, is the fellow that would say that. And I'm sure that if someone were to listen to one of those clips and hear that statement, they might think, oh, that's interesting. Roger says the opposite. And so one of them must be right and one of them must be wrong. Now, what point is Bruce Lipton making when he says that? What he's saying is that you make a change in this moment to your diet, to your exposure to the sun, to the environment that you spend your time in. That change is going to have an effect on your health. And so if someone comes in with the attitude, the misunderstanding of the theory that says, in each moment, you're going to function according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and think that that concept is an absolute concept that is talking about and is valid from every point of view, then they might find that new information is ingrained in the system in a way that it's not intended, in a way that might create complacency, for example. Like, oh, well, there's nothing I can do, so I might as well just not pay any attention to changing something in the moment. And what certain objectives, certain teachings that have certain objectives, and not just spiritual teachings, will be looking at a mindset that humanity has and look at that and say, that's a problem. And they'll say, how do I fix that problem? And they'll come up with a concept that addresses the problem. And so one of the problems, or one of the objectives here is, not here, but I think it's Bruce Lipton. I remember seeing something a year ago or so. Is that what his focus is, I think, on trying to get people to heal, to allow the body to do its own healing, to do its own health management. And in order for that to happen, certain changes in the system need to happen, certain understanding that that is possible. So it seems like, from his point of view, that if someone finds that they put attention onto the healing capacities of the body because they've heard about it, then that, what I understand is he's saying that attention will activate that functionality in the body. That visualizing can be part of the healing process of the body, which really means that some conscious movements can lead to the health system in the body functioning much better than it does when we aren't performing certain activities consciously. And so that teaching has the objective of bringing about human health. Now, human health is different to human happiness. They might have common ground. They both are very important. They're different topics, so they're going to have different theories that are addressing different problems as those problems relate to a specific outcome. And if our thinking thinks, oh, well, Bruce Lipton's a spiritual teacher, he talks about consciousness, because a lot of what he's talking about in this health thing is about consciousness and an awakening to consciousness and how it can help heal the body. So someone might hear and go, oh, there's two spiritual teachers, they're talking about the same thing because they're spiritual teachers, and not hear the nuanced reason why two sounding or concepts that are opposite are both valid, and they're both true relative to different objectives, different goals, relative to, or if there are certain obstacles in the way, those concepts can be seen as valid. Even a concept that is wrong, if it's being used specifically to undo an obstacle, it's right. And someone might hear the concept and go, that concept isn't right. Because the content of the concept may be technically not right. And if the person understands, the person using it knows what problem they're trying to undo, and they have decided that that concept is ideal for undoing the problem, even if it is technically wrong relative to the objective of being factually correct on the topic of the concept can be 100% valid if it's being chosen because it is useful to undo a specific error. So once again, it's important to see the relativity of concepts and not relate to them as absolute. Start being able to see why a concept is being said rather than just focusing on the content, because you could make a fool of yourself. And it's not about making a fool of yourself. It's really about learning how to think Because if you just hear the concept and you start arguing that the concept is wrong, what do I mean by that? Try and think of a concept. I can't off the top of my head. And you're arguing about the content of the concept rather than understanding what it's trying to address, what topic it's trying to address, then you're missing the point. And effectively, you're wrong, even if you're right. You might be right about your point, but you've missed the point. You've come into a conversation missing the point. And so actually you're wrong. It sounds like it's got nothing to do with spirituality. Spirituality, spirituality is life, but spiritual seeking is really about the falling away of illusion, the falling away of the false sense of self, the falling away of the outputs, the expressions of the false sense of self. And when we start to look into it, we see the false sense of self is deeply ingrained beliefs. And what is at the base of a belief? It's a concept that says, 1 + 1 is 2. Now, that's a correct concept. But what if we said 1 + 3 is 2? That's a concept. 1 + 3 is 2. It's an incorrect concept. And if that's locked away, 1 + 3 is 2, locked away and taken to be truth, that's a belief. Now, even if we have the concept 1 + 1 equals 2 and it's locked away as truth, then it's a belief. And someone might say, well, that's okay because it's an accurate concept. And so turning into the belief is okay. No, the very movement of turning a concept into a belief is itself wrong. Not because the content of the concept is wrong, but because the attitude of treating a concept as absolute is wrong. That's bad thinking. So as soon as a belief is locked away, whether the content of the belief is right or wrong, it's a problem. When the content of the belief is incorrect, then it's an even bigger problem. So suffering is about the end of the expressions coming from the false sense of self. Now, if we just say the false sense of self, it's a very abstract concept, the false sense of self. It doesn't really tell us where to look or how that expresses itself, how it manifests. So how can we land on it? How can we start to understand what the false sense of self is in practical, pragmatic terms where we can see it? And so I'll put forward the concept that the false sense of self is based on deeply ingrained beliefs about who and what I am. Beliefs that are so ingrained that they create the sense of a very concrete identity, a very concrete me that is very rigidly defined by the ingrained beliefs about who I am and what I am. And those beliefs are complex. They include a sort of fairly primary belief, like I am the body, is one part of the belief. And then there is another part that says, oh, and I am separate and in control of everything that I do. And as the body, these are my preferences. And this is how I need life to turn out. Essentially, pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so everyone has a very complex self-identity based on all of these ideas about who we are. And what we are is something much less defined, much less definable. Even if we were the body, and it's a shame to limit it's like calling the apple red and round and sweet. It's so much more than that. And as soon as it is believed, it's pigeonholed, it's reduced down to the idea of it rather than the feeling, the knowing of it. And so that's one of the reasons why we feel disconnected from self, is because the deeply ingrained beliefs, the false sense of self, is how we have come to know ourselves. Essentially, we know ourselves in terms of in a psychological way, which really means based on our beliefs of ourself. And those beliefs are continually being triggered by the functioning of the other, the circumstance we find ourselves in, how things unfold, how we function. It's continually being triggered by all of those things, because that idea about how life should look and how I should look, how the other should look, is continually forced to judge and to react and to resist, to blame, to feel shame, to have expectations. And the great news is that what we are is far vaster than our idea of who we are. And so as this psychological me starts to dissolve, there's a capacity to connect to something more true, you can say, more real, more of what we are. And we'll find that what we are is much less defined than our thinking does credit for. Our thinking wants to define everything, wants to pigeonhole and know, because it can then try and control and have certainty. And all of those things are the things that prevent freedom from flourishing. The irony is the false sense of self wants certainty. It hates the notion of uncertainty. Uncertainty seems scary to it. It's the basis on which fear arises. Whereas to the sense of who we really are, if you were offered certainty, if you were offered the end of change, it would sound like a tragedy. It would be known that no, that would be terrible if life was known and certain. And yet, to the false sense of self, that's what it is craving, because that identity is very challenged by the unknown, by change, because it is a belief that is static and has a static idea of what would be ideal. And because life is never static, it's always changing. And so this sense of self is always challenged by the change in life. But when that idea has dissolved, that me that lives life and feels so challenged and so triggered and so forced to explode into certain psychological movements all the time during the day, when that starts to dissolve, there's an appreciation of what we are, and the uncertainty, the mystery is seen as a gift. feeling is very important in this movement. To feel is the beginning of dropping out of thinking. Thinking, without us realizing it, is sort of quite two-dimensional relative to feeling. And because we may have been living life through thought from the mind, disconnected from a place in the human being that is much more grounded in the present, it might not seem like that's what's happening because the contrast isn't available. That knowing life through thought, through judgment, has seemed like the only way that you can know life. And so being encouraged to feel, to drop into the body, to drop into the heart, the spiritual heart is referred to in Ramana teaching as not the physical heart, but the heart center on one of the body layers. And it's said to be just right of center. The physical heart is on the left of center. Maybe it's that point out to make it clear that it's not the physical heart. But it's sort of in the same area as the heart because these different bodies are like layers or sheaths. And many of the energy centers have corresponding energy centers on each of the different sheaths or bodies. So the physical body has a physical heart, and the energetic body has an energetic heart. And the physical heart and the energetic heart are more than likely connected. So the different layers, the sheaths, one in front of the other, are not working independent, but they're interdependent on each other. So all of the sheaths, all of the different energy bodies and the emotional bodies and the thought body and the physical body and various other bodies make up the whole. So we can talk about them as separate sheaths or layers or bodies. That's a conceptual description to help us maybe feel them, because often we need to have a conceptual description about something in order to feel it, to see it where previously it wasn't seen. But eventually we need to bring those conceptual descriptions that sort of can make us think that they are separate, because we're thinking of them as separate because the languaging is referring to them in dualistic terms as if there is one and the other. At some point we need to see, oh, that's a conceptual distinction. The concept is breaking it up into two parts, like talking about a tree and talking about the leaves and the fruit. And when we use word leaves and fruit, then we say, oh, it's two. Is it really two, or is it facets of the tree overall? So this is another part of our thinking that needs to come in and realize that concepts can create separation where separation doesn't exist. And the separation can be useful because it can allow us to see things that have merged in a way that they are not recognizable. So the conceptual distinction can create a unmerging or a demerging so that they can be seen. But then once they have demerged, we also have to realize that in practice, they don't exist independent of each other. So they are really one, but we get to see the two layers like genes and up-to-date conditioning is a good example. So I talk about genes and up-to-date conditioning. So conceptually, there have been conceptual distinction, which might make us think that there are genes and there is up-to-date conditioning, whereas actually the genes and up-to-date conditioning are not two. In the end, it is one unit, the human being, as a result of the genes and the up-to-date conditioning. But we can create a conceptual distinction between the two in order for there to be a clearer understanding of what is meant by up-to-date conditioning. So then we introduce the concept of new conditioning. So life delivers new conditioning in each moment, and the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning is what we call the up-to-date conditioning in the moment. And as new conditioning comes in, which it always is, the up-to-date conditioning is changing to account for the new conditioning that has become part of the up-to-date conditioning. And that new conditioning is received by the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the new conditioning, as soon as it meets the genes and up-to-date conditioning, becomes part of the whole. And the genes and up-to-date conditioning are a whole. And incidentally, why was Bruce Lipton saying that you're not destined according to your genes? And it's on this basis that there's new conditioning coming in each moment. And the new conditioning changes the whole. And so if we think about genes as a separate thing that doesn't change, then we've got the notion of genes incorrect. And so if someone has that notion, then another teaching will say, that's not how it works. Your genes are not going to destine your future because of the way they are now. Because in the next moment, something new can come in, which will change them. And then your destiny will be according to the changed version. Incidentally, what I've just said doesn't change the fact that we're never in control of our destiny. Our destiny will only be one way. It is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, but our genes and up-to-date conditioning are always changing. So it means don't notion that everything is happening according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning to think, oh, well, in that case, I shouldn't make any decisions or I shouldn't do anything. The making a decision is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the two concepts, the two teachings are pointing at different objectives, and so they will describe things in the way that is most useful to help achieve that objective. Feeling is important. Drop into the body. Really start to spend time being aware of what's here now. Now, the problem is that if the psychological identity is strong, as soon as you stop and come into the present moment, we might realize that this is not a good place to be. It could be, get me out of here. And get me out of here might be the feeling that was there 30 years ago. And when it was felt 30 years ago, the instruction was, get me out of here. And where do you think the body-mind always sent? If here in the body, present with what is, was really uncomfortable, which is interesting given that our happiness, our peace of mind, the silence, the stillness is to be found here in the same place that when we visit it, can seem like hell. Where did the body, mind, organism send us? It sent us out of here. Yeah. So there was some refuge in thinking. It's like, oh, let me create a world and a sense. Let me busy myself. Whatever the body, mind, organism put in place as its defense mechanism to that uncomfortable feeling is what happened. And often it creates a disconnection from the body, which is essentially the portal into presence. And so in seeking, if we're directed to come into the body and then it feels uncomfortable, we might say, oh no, that I must have misunderstood, because that's not where happiness is. And it might be that we need to spend some time there to clear out the cupboard. So before we take some questions, I had spoken about the psychological identity, the false sense of self, the me that has formed, that is essentially belief, which at their root are concepts about who and what I am and what I need and how life should be and how the other should act. And it's worth talking about the main beliefs that we can describe as being the root of the false sense of self, so that they can be felt. They can be seen and felt. They arise. And if we have the description of them being the false sense of self, and the expression of the false sense of self, the flowering of the false sense of self, that essentially is a deeply ingrained set of beliefs, then that might be something we can feel, and that takes us down onto the level of knowing the concepts for ourselves based on our own life experience, beyond the concept. So I'll mention the story that I've used quite a lot of times about having been told one time that if you smile at a monkey, the monkey will take that as a sign of aggression. When I was told that, I was listening to it and I thought, that's strange, smiling. Why would a monkey take smiling as a sign of aggression? And so I thought about it, because I obviously hadn't got it, because it didn't make sense to me. And so you look at something a little bit laughy, you realize, all right, so I smiled, and then I realized, oh, you're showing your teeth. So in the animal world, obviously, then it made sense. Showing your teeth means aggression. So that was interesting. It's an interesting concept. But there was no monkey in my world at that time. So it is just a concept. But it became part of my up-to-date conditioning. So the concept was delivered by a friend or because I was reading something, and it became part of the up-to-date conditioning, new conditioning delivered up-to-date conditioning. And several years later, I was walking in India, in Tiruvannamalai, up to the Ramana cave, and there are lots of monkeys on that path. And this little monkey, very young, few weeks old probably, was one on the side of the wall, and as I walked past, it was reaching out. It wanted to play with the people walking past. And so I stopped and looked at it, and it had wrinkles and very small ears and big bulging eyes. And I was looking at its fingers, and the fingers are very sort of human-like and well-defined, but very tiny. This was a very small, newbornish, few weeks old monkey. And I was fascinated. I was in awe about the beauty of nature. And I had this warm feeling in my heart, and I smiled at the monkey. And as soon as I smiled, the monkey jumped back and screeched. And the mother came running over, ready to fight, because that screech obviously was a sign of danger. That was an intuitive movement in the baby. And in that instant, I remembered, oh, if you smile at a monkey, they're going to take it as a sign of aggression. And that then became evident in my own experience. And so the concept in that moment revealed itself. That's the best way of saying it. The concept revealed itself in my own experience, and I was able to see it. And that's when it's like, there it is. So it was understood intellectually, but I didn't know whether it was true. I didn't have a deeper experience of what was being pointed at with that concept. If I didn't understand it intellectually, if at the time it didn't click that they would take it as a sign of aggression because of teeth, and it might have just washed over me and like, oh, whatever, seems like a silly thing. Then later on, when this event happened and I smiled at the monkey and the monkey shrieked, I might not even have clicked that was going on. I might have thought, well, that's weird. What's all that about? But because of the combination of having understood it intellectually and then it presenting in real life, a very significant click happens where the understanding goes deeper, much deeper. It becomes a much more powerful concept, because it's not just an intellectual concept for you anymore. So if it came up in conversation at some other time and you heard someone say, if you smile at a monkey, it'll be taken as a sign of aggression. And the other person listening says, oh, don't be silly. What are you talking about? And the other person might explain to this person, other guy, oh, you just believe something you read, and they don't. And I might say, excuse me, I don't know if you'd like my input, but let me tell you, it's absolutely the way that things work. Like, no doubt about it. Incidentally, I checked out this smiling time because seeing something once is useful, but you want to know that the concept is more robust than that. And so I smiled at several other monkeys over the course of the next month and got different results. Most of them tended to show me that, yes, a monkey will take a smile as a sign of aggression, but in certain instances, they couldn't care less because they're far enough away or whatever. And with a big male monkey, he came rushing towards me. So it's a good reason not to smile at big male monkeys, because the little ones jump away, but the big male monkeys stand their ground. And so with the spiritual concepts, they're just descriptions that, happiness for the human being is not to be found in pleasure, which really means that's where we think it's to be found. That's what that concept is saying. Human happiness is not to be found in pleasure. So stop looking for it there. You're not going to find happiness. You're not going to get the result of human happiness by seeking pleasure, by looking for it in circumstance, which means believing that when life looks a certain way in the future, then I'll be happy. What will happen is then life might be more pleasurable in circumstance, and you'll still have the basis on which unhappiness, even in the face of pleasurable circumstance, will arise from time to time. So that concept happiness isn't to be found in pleasure might be understood intellectually. We might actually think, because often we're not familiar with when something is understood intellectually and when it's known. Because when it's understood intellectually, we say, I get it. I understand it completely, is what we'll say. So someone can say, I understand non-doership fully. But how come I still suffer when this? Because you don't understand it fully. What is, you understand the concept intellectually very well. You've heard it thousands of times. You can write essays about what the concepts are, but we don't understand it fully. So we need to understand the difference, so we don't go around saying, I understand non-doership fully, because that's wrong. If we say, I have a very good intellectual understanding of it, but in practice it hasn't sunk deep enough, then that's great for us to realize, because we understand the landscape better. But sometimes we don't realize that we understand something intellectually, and then life conspires. Let's say you are for a long time craving to receive a redundancy from your work, because then you will be able to stop that job. You'll be able to have a buffer of income for a year where you can take time off or look for another job. And you're sure that that is what you want in life. And there is this expectation, this investment, this belief that when I get that, then I'll be happy. And let's say you get that, and 2 days later or 3 days later, a week later, you realize that there's still an uncomfortableness. Even though the circumstance has turned out pleasurable, there's an uncomfortable, and then an insight, not just, but an insight, my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. And you'll know that from your own experience, because you got the circumstance you thought would make you happy. And yet a new uncomfortableness about something else, about your neighbor going to work at 6:30 in the morning and slamming, or at 5 in the morning, whatever, and slamming the doors or the gate that wakes you up. And then there's an uncomfortableness with that, a hate, a resentment towards him. You ask him if he can be more quiet because he wakes you up, and he keeps doing the same thing. And so the resentment is there. And you realize that there's unhappiness, but now it's not about having to go to work and because you've got your redundancy, but it's about something else. And it might click, like really click where you get it. And you thought you got it before, but before it was an intellectual understanding, and you wouldn't be able to argue it and support it based on your own recognition, your own deep seeing of what the concept is really pointing at. So in the framework, the psychological identity is explained conceptually as being the belief of personal doership and the belief of attachment to outcome. So we spoke about this a little bit yesterday, in yesterday's satsang, and they are very much interconnected. Now, the reason that conceptually the doership, the belief in personal doership, meaning I believe that what I am is primarily the body. That's our experience of ourself until we start finding our attention turning inwards, where we get to appreciate the formless aspect of the human being, the consciousness, the awareness. So before that happens, we tend to know ourselves in terms of the body, which is the more prevalent aspect of our experience, and the emotions and the thoughts. So we know ourselves as this, and the sensation in life is that I'm making everything happen, that there is a controller, a pilot inside this body organism that chooses how it functions. So that is the belief in personal doership, and that belief is projected onto everyone else. We see them as being the pilots of how they function in life and pilot of what happens as a result of their functioning. So that's the belief in personal doership. And why is that pointed out? It's pointed out because so much of the suffering that arises is based on that belief, that belief is essentially an attitude towards how we interpret what happens through this body-mind organism, both the deeds and the consequences, so the actions and the results, and the feelings, whether we feel good about life, whether we feel bad about life, whether we judge someone, whether we are joyful, the thoughts and the emotions, all of that bundle of stuff is related to, meaning our attitude towards that is one that claims ownership of it. It says, me and mine, I did that. I, as the doer, which really means as the pilot, as the controller, as the one at the steering wheel, the one at the stick. And that is our ingrained self-image. And so when we look back at the past and we think about the things that haven't worked out, we feel heavy about that. And the thinking about that is persisting because it's been locked in as part of the self-identity. Oh, I should have done that differently. We don't forget about it. It remains in the identity. And so it keeps presenting itself over and over again. It's what I did, and what I did led to that outcome that was a painful outcome, which is then seen to be as an attack on my happiness, because there's the second part of the identity, and the second part of the identity is convinced that being this doer, which is primarily a physical object that thinks and feels, it has become convinced that the happiness that it's looking for is dependent on outcomes, dependent on what the other does, which really results in outcomes, whether someone smiles at me or they don't. So if they smile at me, the outcome, the result is pleasure or pain. If someone scowls at you, which is their behavior, their action, it is painful as opposed to them smiling at you. Well, unless you don't want them to be smiling at you. I've seen many people who would rather some people aren't smiling at them. So what the other person does delivers pleasure or pain to a person. And that is deemed to be what will make me complete or not complete. So we're essentially moving through life believing that I am in control and the other is in control, which leads to guilt, blame, and pride. And simultaneous to that, there is the belief that what I need in life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And pleasure, pleasure, pleasure will be delivered by my actions. And whether they're perfect, if they're perfect, it'll deliver pleasure. The other's actions, if they're perfect, it will deliver pleasure. How life unfolds, whether it's sunny or it's raining. And so that is what is going to determine my satisfaction, and that's going to happen in the future. Now, if we didn't have an attachment to pleasure, and the deepest attachment to pleasure is love of the other, right? That's the deepest attachment we have, meaning really deep down inside, we believe that my happiness is to be found when the other loves me, when the other doesn't abandon me, when the other understands me, when the other validates me, when the other listens to me, when the other appreciates me, when the other is nice to me, when the other smiles at me, when the other does what I would like them to, what I like. If I like flowers, then I will be happy when the other gives me flowers. That's a rudimentary expression of one of the forms in which we are looking for love from the other. So it goes much deeper than wanting flowers. If we didn't have an attachment essentially means the belief that my completeness, my happiness, my wholeness is to be found when the other delivers to me something, which really means my sense of being dependent on outcomes, dependent on something in the future, dependent on something out there. If we didn't have that sense of self that said, I am not complete now, and I will be complete when life conspires to complete me by giving me stuff. If that wasn't there, we wouldn't blame people for not delivering stuff. It's like if you have a really, really old, broken down bicycle in your front garden that is not going to be used, isn't worth anything, and in fact, you keep meaning to take it to the rubbish tip and throwing it away, but you never get round to it. If someone steals that, are you going to blame them? No, because you couldn't care less that it's been stolen. In fact, you might thank someone for getting rid of it for you. Now, on the other hand, if there was a strong sense of investment in that item, and saying that item is part of what will complete me. Now, if it's taken away, you're going to be furious. You're going to feel attacked, and you're going to hate the one that took it away, even if you don't know who they are. You will just hate the imaginary someone that did this to you, or the imagination of the person that did this to you, because of your attachment, the importance of that relative to who you believe yourself to be. So doership, the guilt and the blame and the pride, really stems from one perspective, we say it stems from the fact that we are attached to outcomes. If outcomes are known to be pleasure or pain, which they are, but not seen to be something that adds or subtracts from who I am at my essence. So compared to when we believe that they are something, pleasure and pain is something that adds or subtracts to me at my essence, it changed in importance significantly. On the one hand, I need that in order to be complete. And on the other hand, it's like, well, at best it's pleasure, at worst it's pain, but I remain complete. You can see there, there's going to be a very different attitude towards pleasure or pain and its importance. So if the attachment to outcome isn't there, the blame towards the other is going to be much less intense, much less reason for there to be blame towards the other. And the same with your blame towards yourself. If you think that your way of acting and behaving that has led to a painful outcome is an attack on your completeness, you're going to hate yourself. You're going to blame yourself as the doer, but not only as the doer, but as the doer because it has affected your happiness, or we think it's affected your happiness. So on the one hand, you can say if you got rid of attachment to outcome, then doership would fall away. It doesn't really work like that. It tends to be that they are sort of like a feedback loop. When we realize that the other is not the doer, and that I'm not the doer, that life is living us all, and we are essentially expressions of life doing exactly what life wants us to do in each moment for life to look exactly the way it looks. Then on that basis, we say, well, even if my happiness is dependent on outcomes, if we still have attachment to outcomes, if the other isn't the doer and I'm not the doer, then there's no point blaming the other and blaming myself or expecting the future to be a certain way. And so if the doership falls away, we might say that the attachment to outcome wouldn't be there. So it isn't really about picking which one is it, which one is deeper down. They are interdependent and probably not independent or separate. That's why I say that they are the two aspects, the two facets of the psychological identity. And as one weakens, the other weakens, especially if they are both presented and described as errors, erroneous attitudes towards oneself and towards what we think we need, and erroneous idea of how life unfolds. And so they tend to weaken together. Ideally, they weaken together. Often these movements aren't even talked about, doership and attachment to outcome. And what is spoken about is the realization of oneself, the awakening to the formless aspect. And we're told that as that formlessness, then you don't need anything. And that's true. The weakening of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome allows us to see our formlessness. But we can also come to our formlessness without weakening the attachment and doership in a way that removes it. So some teachings can disable the attachment and the doership by essentially temporarily shutting down the faculty of thinking through certain concepts. And we can have an awakening to this formless awareness. And yet the doership will continue to spring into action, because the teachings that shut down the thinking are not going to be able to shut it down in a way where it isn't triggered when circumstance happens. And so what will happen is there'll be this being dragged out of knowing yourself as formless awareness, which I say is not where we're meant to end up living anyway, because the deeply ingrained psychological identity hasn't gone anywhere. And so sometimes there's the notion that it's just about witnessing the psychological identity and not being involved in it, which, as you've all heard me say, is a very significant shift. It is seeing the doership and the attachment to outcome, or the primary suffering, as a happening and not your doing. The principle of seeing it as a happening and not your doing requires us hopefully to understand the concept that life is a happening, that these inner feelings are a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we didn't put in place. And so when the conceptual framework is delivered such that we have clear descriptions of the obstacles on both layers, the obstacles that are the psychological identity, with a description of what that psychological identity is, essentially the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, both of which are not accurate descriptions of the dynamics of life, and instruction or description that encourages a dropping into being, a stopping, a feeling, a being present, a knowing yourself as awareness and consciousness that is functioning through the body, then hopefully the process, the seeking, becomes integrated process that allows us eventually to live life as a human being, not even thinking about life as being unreal, not even thinking about ourself being consciousness or awareness, because we get to live as the human being, and it becomes very obvious that the human being is a conscious and aware human being. And we'll find that once the belief in doership and attachment to outcome has dissolved, and once, as a result of that weakening of doership and attachment to outcome, there is a connection to the consciousness and awareness aspect of the human being, we can then live life like that, doing much more of what we feel like doing much more of what the biological intelligence is asking of us, rather than doing what we should and shouldn't do in order to get the best outcomes according to our strategy of getting what we need in order to be happy in the future, which is all based on this attachment to outcome that has got life completely wrong. And therefore it makes sense that the instructions it's giving us are also off track. We get to live as the human being, free of suffering, doing in each moment whatever we feel like doing, given our capabilities, given our circumstances, given our means, and realizing that that's the best that we can hope for in life. And it's pretty good. The freedom from suffering is a huge relief. Seeking stops. Questions stop. We realize that all the questions are part of the thinking mind, which is part of the suffering. Why is this happening? Because that's life. Why are people dying from illnesses? That's life. Why did I lose so much money? That's life. Why is that person so kind to me? That's life. A mix of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Why did I act that way? That's life. Your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So all of these questions of why fall away because we know the answers. And that doesn't prevent us from doing whatever we think we can in the moment to improve a situation. We'll say, that's life, for me to do what I can to improve a situation. But psychologically, I won't get involved in the outcome because I understand that life is me not being in control of the outcome. So I'll do what I can to improve a situation, but understand the outcome is not in my control. So once I've done my best, I have to sit back and wait and see what happens. Life becomes very simple, not necessarily easy, Ramesh would say. So your circumstance might mean you have to work 8-hour days. So it's not going to be easy. You might have to work 8-hour days doing fairly strenuous labor. But it'll be very simple. It's like you wake up in the morning and you know you have a complete range of options. You don't have to go into work if you don't want, but you understand that there will be a consequence. There always is a consequence. So I don't know what the consequence is, but I can understand that consequence is likely to be me losing my job. And so if you decide that's what you want to do, you have the freedom to not go into work. You might be surprised. You might say, the outcome's not in my control, and sometimes things work out much better than I expect. So in each moment, you're free to do whatever you want. With a clear understanding, you will say, I understand that outcomes are not where my happiness is to be found. So someone might say, well, in that case, wouldn't you say, I don't feel like going into work. Me losing my job, if I don't go into work, is just an outcome. So if my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, I might as well stay at home. Say, yes, it's true. If you have the right attitude to staying home, losing your job, then you'll say, it was destined for that to be my feeling in the moment. It was destined for me to run with that. It was destined for me to lose my job as a result. And it was destined for me now to have no money and to be hungry, possibly. So with that attitude, you will be in pain, which is part of the flow of life, but not filled with suffering, which might be regret and shame and all of that. On the same basis, if you have that understanding, you know that, yes, going to work is delivering an outcome. Your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, but you also understand that outcomes are part of the flow of life, sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And you might say, I understand that money is not my happiness, but it does buy food, and given my circumstance, I choose to go to work. Even if I say on one level, I don't feel like it, I'm tired, I don't feel like going to work, but overall, I feel like going to work because I would like the pay from work so I can buy my food. But I understand I'm not investing my happiness. I'm not saying my happiness is dependent on that. And why is that important? That's important because at some point we need to have enough space in circumstance that allows us to sometimes make changes without fear. Because we understand, I could get another job. In fact, I'd like another job. And if we look at it realistically, we say, well, I'm qualified for several other jobs. I've taken the step. And so if we understand, actually, my happiness, my completeness isn't dependent on me having this job and having money for food. I'm sure there's other ways that I can survive. If it got that bad that I had no money for food, in some people's circumstances, you say, I could ask my friend, I can ask my parents to support me for a period of time. In some circumstances, some people don't have that capacity, and keeping the job is intelligent and sensible. When we're afraid and we think that our happiness is to be found in outcomes, the fear will prevent us from bringing about change when change is actually available. And this happens in certain relationships a lot, where there is an attachment to the relationship, and yet the relationship is a relationship that doesn't satisfy, that delivers pain. And the truth is that the person could leave the relationship and may actually find themselves very happy, much more happy than when they're in the relationship. And the truth is there's nothing practically stopping the person from leaving the relationship. And yet the attachment to outcomes, the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, the belief that this relationship is much more about who I am than it really is, the belief of that can keep someone stuck in the relationship. So that's why it's important to understand, actually, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. It brings the outcome down to it brings our outlook on the outcome down to a realistic and rational outlook. An outlook that says the outcome is going to be pleasure or pain, and pleasure and pain is a relevant part of life, but it's not where my happiness is, not where my happiness is to be found. And then we might say, and actually what I'm looking for is happiness. And maybe happiness is to be found in making that move. Because, so that might be strange. Someone says, but I thought you said that your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So how can happiness be part of making that move? And the reason that that's the case is that if we've got into certain structures, if certain structures have built themselves around attachment to outcome, so certain relationships that we got into them many years ago when there was a certain attachment to love, for example, for as long as that structure maintains itself, if it's maintaining itself on the same principle that we got into it from, then just simply being in that relationship, being in that same job, is reinforcing the belief in attachment to outcomes. And so sometimes life requires us to reverse out of structures that we moved into with a certain attitude. So if we went into certain structures with the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes, it may require a backing out of those structures in order for the doership attachment to fall away. It doesn't have to, because if it's your destiny to remain in that circumstance and your destiny to be happy, and it was your destiny to get into that circumstance because of doership and attachment, it is very possible for the belief in doership and attachment to be undermined while in that structure, and then for you to find yourself attitudinally very different to life, and yet still in a structure that essentially was put in place because of doership and attachment. What means the structure is no longer held in place by doership and attachment outcome, because that has dissolved. And yet, for whatever reason, the structure can maintain itself on a new basis. So we never really know what life should look like. And that's why the encouragement is we need to start doing what we feel like rather than what we should and shouldn't. Our shoulds and shouldn'ts are so often based on conditioning from society that is telling us that life is about doership and attachment to outcome. And the shoulds and shouldn'ts are based on our strategy of how to get happiness in the future based on outcomes. So, see if there's some questions. Hello, Philip.
Hello, good morning, Roger. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Sure. Having talked about the framework with almost everyone I know well enough to talk about the framework to them with, you know, all kinds of different walks of life. And, you know, most people are not really on a spiritual seeking path, or at least not consciously so. I find that by far the most difficult, or let's say tricky part to understand is the distinction between psychological suffering and emotional pain. Now, you obviously deliver a very clear description, you know, that emotional pain arises with the circumstance, and then when the circumstance is over and the pain subsides, there is no more attachment. And, you know, you describe it very well, like conceptually, but I feel like it would be very useful if you could maybe provide 2 or 3 examples of emotional pain that you've experienced recently. The more intense the emotional pain, the better the example.
Let me think. I tend to be, okay. Let me think. Well, I can get irritable about certain things, and if someone isn't, let's say, thinking in the way that I like, it will create an emotional reaction in me. Now, when I'm talking about emotion, I mean a cry. Like often we think about emotional as being sad and crying, but anger, irritation is also an emotion, an emotional reaction. And so if I explain something often and the person still thinks differently to what my repetitive explanations were, I do find an irritation that arises in the present moment. And that irritation is because the functioning, the circumstance is painful. I would prefer that line of rationale, for example, that is put forward by the other person, which I might say is not rational, or doesn't hold water, and this is why it doesn't hold water. If that's continually getting put forward, there can be a frustration. Now, that frustration arises in the moment, and then as soon as it's arisen, I'm very happy to say, let's just leave it. let's let it be. So there isn't a need to go into it and to win and there isn't an ongoing seeing the other person as the doer that could have done it differently. And even in the present moment, the reaction can seem like someone would say, well, you're seeing the person as the doer because you're reacting as if they could do it differently. And I can understand how this is so subtle that it can seem like that. But that's why we have this distinction that says there are going to be emotional biological reactions in the moment. And if it is an emotional biological reaction, then it doesn't have the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, even if it is interpreted from an outside view as having the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome in it. Like someone would say, well, you must be attached to them thinking in line with how you'd like them to think, because otherwise you wouldn't have this emotional outburst. And I'd say, no, the emotional outburst is based on whether their thinking is in line with my preference or not in line with my preference. It has nothing to do with doership. And it has nothing to do with attachment. It has to do with pleasure or pain delivered in the moment. So just in the same way as someone drops a brick on your foot, the fact that you might move your foot and shout in pain is not an indication of seeing them as the doer or being attached to that not happening. The shouting, the hopping around on one foot is a consequence of the physical and the circumstantial happening. And so if someone says, if you weren't attached to the outcome, you would just sit there still Zen-like. And then go, well, you see, that's the misunderstanding. There is the internal attitude, especially after the circumstance. And then there is the biological reaction, which is going to be physical and emotional, or emotional. And an emotional reaction in the moment can be very warranted based on a circumstance, depending on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, because someone else may have their preference not delivered and their response, their emotional response, their biological response can be very different, where they don't express an irritation. Maybe they don't even feel an irritation because of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's, I guess, as good as I can do. And I do agree that it is a subtlety that is so hard to understand intellectually, because the truth is that emotional pain is fairly intense, and the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, if it's in the system, is almost guaranteed to arise with emotional pain. If that's in the system, what I'm describing as emotional pain will be when someone feels what I seem to be describing in them, it's almost guaranteed to have the suffering intertwined in it. The attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, to the fact that the person has acted that way and created pain in you and all of that. And so it only becomes, I have to say, if it was that was the last distinction that became clear to me. And it only became clear after me saying to Ramesh, but I just simply can't see anger and sadness as not suffering. They feel like suffering when they arise in me. And it became apparent that that was the case because I had an expectation. I had an image that enlightenment meant the end of irritation, the end of anger, the end of sadness, because they were the pains in life that still had suffering intertwined in them. So whenever they came up, it felt like suffering. And I said, well, peace is the end of feeling. And I just didn't realize the intertwined nature of the suffering with the biological or the emotional pain. And it took Ramesh's insistence and my destiny, luckily, of life showing me the distinction at some point after me testing it for a long time. And then when it became felt, when it became seen in action, then I had enough sort of personal evidence that started to demonstrate that that concept is actually correct, even though I couldn't feel it, couldn't resonate with it before. Once I was on board, because I got a sense, I saw what it was pointing at. Once I was on board with it being accurate, then it unraveled very quickly. So given it was the last thing that I came to see, I guess it is one of the more subtle points in the teaching.
Yeah, for sure. There's the framework, the way you word it is that in each moment there's either pleasure or pain. And I feel like our life experience is so layered and complex and so many senses. I was wondering if you would allow for a description that says there can be both pleasure and pain at the same time. And I will give you an example that that some people will derive emotional pleasure from physical pain. For instance, in a very subtle instance, just scratching at an itch. So I feel like you scratch the itch and there's the physical pain, but there's also this kind of like emotional pleasure at the same time. How do you feel about that?
I'm not sure that's a great example to describe your point. Maybe it is, because I think that the scratching of the itch is a relief of the physical pain. Like if you don't scratch the itch, then an itch, you could say, is painful. But I think the scratching of the itch is the relief of the physical and an emotional. I might be wrong. So the thing is, completely agree with your point. I don't think the example is the best example.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But the fact is that the concepts are often oversimplistic. Not often, as in mostly. I think this teaching tends to go into specifics more than others, but still the principle that says, this is a concept, not the truth, and it's a concept to illustrate something, means the concepts are going to be limited, and then they require you to do your own expansion of them. And so the point you make is completely spot on, is that the complexity of the present moment means that you can have pain from the sun shining on you and it can be too hot or bright. You might be but you might be with a friend of yours that you are having a great conversation with.
Yeah, exactly. That's a much better example.
So yes, no, this is, and even I think something that throws a lot of people is that life is either pleasure or pain, and so much of our life experience seems like it's neutral. And so they say, well, there's this pleasure pain spectrum, but what about neutral? And to me, is a point on the pleasure pain spectrum. It's like a hairline in the middle that essentially not even a hairline. And so there are just different degrees of pleasure or pain, but such a large part of the spectrum is degrees of pleasure or pain that are so normalized to us, or so not extreme, that they feel like neutral. And so if someone were to say, that concept, what about neutral? I sort of agree with neutral as well. but at the same time understanding that what we call neutral, what we feel as neutral, is just very mild pleasure or pain.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
one
I understand.
one other concept, which is subject to criticism, and the criticism is valid, but it's described this way because it can be very useful at helping point out a very important point, is when we talk about biological pain as being vertical in time and the psychological suffering being horizontal in time. And there are forms of biological pain that are not, that are quite horizontal.
Yeah.
So a headache, for example, can extend for several hours. And so technically that concept of saying biological pain is vertical and suffering is horizontal in time is not absolutely correct. But what it does is it tries to show us that if there is pain that is a very short-lived pain because of a circumstance, and circumstance is always changing. So let's say you stub your toe. The pain of the stubbing the toe is vertical. And then you might see yourself with a story about stubbing your toe for an hour and it reoccurs the next day and whatever. And that's really what it's trying to demonstrate, rather than it's not really about the concepts being truth. And that's why the teaching says nothing that is said is the truth. They're all concepts.
Yeah, thank you. I understand. I have only one more question for today, if I may. Is
Sure.
that I've heard a lot of non-dual teachers talk about that once suffering falls away, even still, though there's this very clear cutoff that, you know, the experience is now one of no more suffering arising, still there is a deepening of peace of mind. And I wonder if you agree with this, and if yes, how can the absence of something, the complete absence of something, deepen?
Yeah, I don't know whether they would say, or whether I would say, that it's a deepening of peace of mind. It, they could say it that way, and there's an explanation for it. Essentially, it's what you're saying is that the deepening means that it hadn't really fallen away earlier, but it may have been, 90% fallen away or 95% fallen away, and that last 5%, which in a way is insignificant,
Yeah.
because in practice, who cares that 5%, arises for 5 minutes every month? It's only if you have an attachment to suffering being 100% gone instead of 95% gone that you then will get hung up on the fact that some suffering arose for 3 seconds or 5 seconds or 2 minutes. Because in practice, it's like once it's finished, I'm happy.
Yeah.
Who cares? So it could be that, and that last 5%, once it sets in, is noticeable that it hadn't set in before, but still in practice, even though it hadn't before, it was more than good enough. And it's only once some more sets in that you realize, oh, there must have been something more, although it didn't feel like there was. That's one explanation. The other explanation is that you have total peace of mind, but I would, even though the teaching sort of makes it sound definitive, as in there's the end of a process, the process of life doesn't ever stop. The process of growth and development and change doesn't ever stop. And so there can be a deepening on so many interconnected levels, simply learning to interact with someone differently, learning how to be, 55 instead of 53. In a sense, it's you're different. It's a continuation of the process, because you knew how to be 53 when you were 53, but when you were 53 you didn't know how to be 55.
Yeah.
So life actually never stops, and so the concept that there is an end of the process is a good concept. It's not the truth. It is accurate, but it's not accurate from all angles. But it's very valid to say, really, the seeking process ends, and there are several ends to the seeking process. There's the end of seeking where you are a desperate seeker. There's the end of seeking when questions, there's just no questions. Then there's the end of seeking when suffering doesn't arise. There's the end of seeking when, the first part, when there's so little suffering that it seems like there's no suffering. Then there can be the end of seeking where even that little suffering falls away. There can be the end of seeking when you die.
Yeah.
So, there's so many different forms of end of seeking. And I think that the relevant, really, for me, well, the end of desperate seeking is very significant, because then the seeking becomes effortless. In that seeking, there's still frustration from time to time. When seeking ends and suffering ends to a point where you say, who cares if some suffering arises? That to me is a very significant shift at that point, compared to everything that was there before in life. And so it's been that point, and the point after it, where there's no suffering, the complete end of suffering. Those 2 points are essentially what have been stuck in there as conceptual endpoints of the seeking. And then you ask me a question like that, and I'd be the first to say that, well, seeking, or not really seeking, but the process of life, the process of growing and learning never ends.
Yeah. Beautifully spoken, Roger.
In that, and never ends, and there is always a deepening. There's always something more.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Philip. I think, given the time, sorry to cut people off if there are questions, but given the time, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you, and peace to you all.